Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The information provided in this video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal, financial, or professional advice. Domestic legal matters, including divorce and custody, are governed by complex state-specific laws that vary significantly across the United States. Historical trends and case studies discussed herein are for illustrative purposes and do not represent a definitive outcome for any individual situation. Viewers are strongly encouraged to conduct their own due diligence and consult with licensed attorneys or qualified professionals before making any decisions regarding their personal or legal affairs. In 1938, thousands of Americans fled their homes in a state of sheer unadulterated panic because of a voice coming through a wooden box. They believed the world was ending, that Martian invaders were incinerating New Jersey, and that society had collapsed in a matter of minutes. This was the power of the theater of the mind, a psychological phenomenon harnessed by the golden age of American radio. Today, for many men across the United States, that same feeling of total world-ending catastrophe isn't coming from a broadcast, it is coming from a legal document served at their front door. The parallels are more striking than you might realize. Just as the listeners of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds were caught off guard by a narrative they didn't understand, many men find themselves blindsided by a legal system and a domestic transition they were never trained to navigate. This is a masterclass in two distinct yet hauntingly similar worlds: the history of how we crafted stories through sound, and the modern strategy for how a man can rewrite his own story when his world feels like it is under siege. To understand where you are going, you have to understand the frequency on which we used to communicate. The American radio drama was the first true mass media experience that unified the North American continent. Before the 1920s, communication was localized. Then came the Radio Act of 1927, which established the Federal Radio Commission. This was the moment the Wild West of the airwaves was tamed, creating a structured environment for national narratives. Think of this as the legal framework of your marriage. When you enter a marriage, you are operating within a structured, regulated environment, often without reading the fine print of the Radio Act that governs your union. In the 1930s, the Golden Age began. Families would gather around the console, a massive piece of furniture that served as the hearth of the home. Programs like The Shadow or Inner Sanctum Mysteries didn't just provide entertainment, they provided a shared reality. However, there is a historical trend we must observe. The reliance on a single source of information is dangerous. When the radio was the only source of truth, people were vulnerable to the narrative. In a modern divorce, if a man relies solely on the narrative being provided by his spouse or a high-conflict legal environment, he is essentially the listener in 1938, reacting to a script he didn't write. The first step in divorce help for men is recognizing the theater of the mind. Much of the fear associated with divorce is psychological projection, the static between the stations. Case studies of high-conflict separations often show that the panic phase is where the most significant legal and financial errors are made. When you hear the Martians are coming, your instinct is to run or lash out. In a legal context, this looks like sending impulsive texts, making emotional social media posts, or agreeing to lopsided temporary orders just to make it stop. Let's look at the data regarding the golden age of divorce filing. Historical trends indicate that in the United States, approximately 69% of divorces are initiated by women. This percentage jumps even higher among college-educated demographics. This isn't just a statistic. It is a signal of a communication breakdown that has its roots in the very way we evolved our domestic broadcasts. In the era of radio drama, scripts were tight, roles were defined, and the Foley artist, the person making the sound effects, ensured every door slam and footstep was heard clearly. In modern relationships, many men have become passive listeners to their own lives. They miss the sound effects of a crumbling foundation. By the time the broadcast changes to a divorce filing, they are 10 steps behind the narrative. To gain control, we must look at the technical specifications of how a radio drama was built. It started with exposition. In your legal journey, exposition is the discovery phase. This is the step-by-step process of identifying every asset, every debt, and every historical fact of the marriage. In the 1940s, a radio engineer would meticulously check the vacuum tubes of a transmitter to ensure a clear signal. In divorce, you must meticulously check your financial vacuum tubes. This means gathering 3 to 5 years of tax returns, bank statements, 401k valuations, and property appraisals. Do not wait for a court order to do this. A historical trend among successful legal outcomes for men is preemptive documentation. If you are the one holding the data, you are the one controlling the signal. Furthermore, consider the invisible narrator. In shows like The Whistler, the narrator knew everything before the characters did. In the U.S. legal system, the invisible narrator is the state law. Many men operate under common law myths. The idea that if they worked harder or paid for everything, they have an inherent right to more of the broadcast. This is often a misconception. Most states operate under equitable distribution or community property frameworks. Understanding the difference is like knowing the difference between AM and FM frequencies. AM, amplitude modulation, travels further but is susceptible to interference. FM, frequency modulation, is clearer but has a shorter range. Equitable distribution is like AM. It is broad, flexible, and subject to a judge's interference or discretion based on what they deem fair. Community property is like FM. It is a clear 50-50 split, but it doesn't account for the static of who worked harder or who was at fault. We must also address the acoustics of the courtroom. In the 1930s, radio studios were padded with heavy curtains to prevent echoes. In a divorce, you need emotional padding. The echo of your anger or your hurt will bounce off the walls of a courtroom and return to haunt you in the form of unfavorable custody rulings or conduct-based alimony adjustments. Historical trends in family law have shifted away from the tender years doctrine, which automatically favored mothers for custody, toward the best interests of the child standard. However, this standard is highly subjective. To succeed, a man must present himself not as a character in a tragedy, but as a reliable broadcaster. This means maintaining a consistent, calm, and documented presence in the children's lives. Case studies show that men who transition from secondary parent to active primary care participant during the separation phase have potential outcomes that favor 50-50 physical custody. Step by step, you must begin your broadcasting audit. First, secure your transmission line. Change every password to every private account. This is not about hiding assets, which is a violation of legal ethics and can lead to severe penalties, but about securing your privacy and preventing signal hijacking. Second, establish your studio. If you are still living in the marital home, the acoustics are likely toxic. If you move out, you must ensure you aren't dead air. In many jurisdictions, moving out without a temporary custody agreement can be framed as abandonment of the broadcast. Third, hire your producer. Your attorney is your producer. They don't just tell the story. They manage the technical requirements of the court. Do not hire a shark who creates static. Hire a master engineer who knows the local judges and the specific frequencies they respond to. The history of American radio taught us that the human voice, when used correctly, can build worlds or destroy them. Your voice in this process, whether in mediation or in a deposition, must be one of historical accuracy. Just as a radio play required a script, your divorce requires a case strategy. We are going to dive deeper into the specific scripts used in the 1950s transition to television and how that mirrors the modern digital footprint in divorce cases, where your text messages and emails become the archived recordings that can either vindicate or convict you in the eyes of the law. We are just scratching the surface of this deep dive. The War of the Worlds was just a play, but the consequences of your broadcast are real. Stay tuned as we move into the logistical breakdown of asset protection and the psychological warfare of the climax of your legal drama. In the late 1940s, a technological revolution fundamentally altered the landscape of American entertainment, moving it from the ephemeral nature of live performance to the permanent, immutable world of recorded sound. This shift was spearheaded by icons like Bing Crosby, who grew weary of the grueling schedule and the high stakes of live national broadcasts where a single slip of the tongue could end a career. He sought refuge in the magnetic tape recorder, specifically the Ampex Model 200. Before this, radio was a now or never event. Once the words left the transmitter, they vanished into the ether, leaving only memory behind. But with magnetic tape, the broadcast became a tangible record that could be spliced, edited, and scrutinized. For a man navigating a domestic dissolution in 2026, you must understand that you no longer live in the era of the live, unrecorded broadcast. Your entire marriage, and especially the moments leading up to your legal separation, has been recorded on the magnetic tape of the digital age. Imagine a scenario involving a man named John, a project manager in a major U.S. metropolitan area. It is January 2026, and John has just been served with divorce papers. In his mind, he is still operating in the live broadcast era. He believes that the arguments, the subtle negotiations over finances, and the private conversations he had in the sanctity of his home are gone. He is mistaken. In the 2026 legal landscape, the discovery process is no longer just about paper bank statements. It is about the metadata of his life. Historical trends in family law show that digital evidence, ranging from smart home logs to location data from fitness trackers, now plays a pivotal role in over 80% of high-stakes divorce cases. John's smart thermostat recorded exactly when he left the house. His shared cloud account archived every deleted photo, and his vehicle's internal computer logged every destination he visited during the months he claimed he was working late. The first rule of logistical asset protection in the digital age is to recognize that your digital footprint is the most accurate witness against you. In the radio era, Foley artists were the unsung heroes who used physical objects to create the illusion of reality. To simulate a forest fire, they would crinkle cellophane near a microphone. To simulate a gunshot, they would slam a ruler against a leather chair. In a modern courtroom, a creative opposing counsel acts as a Foley artist. They take the raw data of your life, the cellophane crinkle of a late-night ATM withdrawal, and amplify it into the roar of a forest fire, suggesting financial dissipation or hidden vices. Step by step, you must conduct a digital forensic audit of your own life before the opposition does. This begins with securing your communication lines. In the 1950s, a radio station would use a dedicated leased line to ensure their signal was not intercepted. In 2026, you must use encrypted communication for all legal and financial discussions. Move your critical communications to platforms that offer end-to-end encryption, and avoid using any shared devices or accounts that were established during the marriage. This brings us to the logistical breakdown of asset protection. We must look at the historical data regarding the dissipation of marital assets. Potential outcomes for men who fail to secure their individual financial identity early in the process are often characterized by significant capital loss. Case studies from the early 2020s into 2026 indicate that the period between the initial filing and the first temporary orders is the most volatile. This is the window where accounts are often drained or credit cards are maxed out in an act of emotional or strategic retaliation. To prevent this, you must understand the concept of the status quo order. In many U.S. jurisdictions, the moment a divorce is filed, an automatic temporary restraining order is placed on marital assets. This does not mean you cannot spend money. It means you cannot significantly alter the financial landscape. However, many men wait until this order is in place to take action, which is a tactical error. Pre-filing logistics involve establishing a separate financial beachhead. This is not about hiding money, which is a high-risk activity that can lead to judicial sanctions or a complete loss of credibility in court. Rather, it is about ensuring you have the liquidity to fund your defense and maintain your standard of living. Historical trends suggest that men who open a separate checking account at a completely different banking institution, not just a different branch, have a higher rate of financial stability throughout the litigation. This prevents the other party from utilizing administrative access or joint ownership to freeze your ability to pay for your attorney. Think of this as the backup generator for a radio station. If the main power grid goes down during a storm, the broadcast must continue. Your legal defense is your broadcast, and it requires a dedicated, uninterruptible power source. Now, let's pivot to the psychological warfare of the climax. In American radio drama, the climax was often achieved through suspense. Programs like Suspense or Escape used a ticking clock or a mounting orchestral score to create a sense of inevitable doom in the listener. In a divorce, the legal system uses procedural delays and the high cost of litigation to create that same sense of inevitable doom in men. This is designed to force a settlement out of exhaustion rather than equity. If you are unprepared for the length of the broadcast, you will run out of airtime. Consider the theater of the mind once more. In the famous Inner Sanctum Mysteries, the show began with the sound of a creaking door. That sound immediately put the audience in a state of unease. In 2026, the creaking door is the constant notification on your phone, the email from the lawyer, the text from the ex-spouse, the alert from the joint bank account. This is a form of psychological foley designed to keep you in a state of high cortisol, where you cannot make rational, long-term decisions. To counter this, you must implement a broadcasting schedule. Decide that you will only check legal emails or communicate about the divorce during specific blocks of time. perhaps between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. Outside of those hours, the transmitter is off. You are reclaiming the airwaves of your own mind. Furthermore, we must address the character assassination phase. In the golden age of radio, actors were often typecast. Once you were the villain, you were always the villain. In a U.S. courtroom, if the opposing side can typecast you as the unstable provider or the neglectful father early in the proceedings, it is incredibly difficult to change that narrative later. This is where the step-by-step documentation of your daily life becomes your production script. If you claim to be an involved parent, but you have no record of school meetings, doctor appointments, or bedtime routines, the court will rely on the Foley provided by the other side. In 2026, use your digital tools to your advantage. Maintain a detailed log of every interaction, every expense, and every milestone. This is your master tape. If the opposition tries to edit the story to make you look like the antagonist, you simply play back the unedited, original recording of your conduct. As we move toward the end of this deep dive into the technical and psychological infrastructure of your transition, we must look at the sponsorship model. Every great radio show had a sponsor: Cavalier Cigarettes, Jell-O, or Palmolive. These sponsors provided the capital that made the art possible, but they also demanded a certain level of decorum and brand alignment. In your life, your sponsors are your support network, your professional reputation, and your financial future. If your behavior during the divorce damages your brand, your sponsors will withdraw. We have seen case studies where a man's professional career, his primary source of capital, is targeted as a leverage point. Protecting your professional reputation is as critical as protecting your bank account. But what happens when the radio drama moves from the studio to the courtroom floor? What happens when the audience is a judge who has heard 1,000 stories just like yours and is looking for a reason to change the channel? In the next part of this masterclass, we will break down the specific scripts of the courtroom, the art of the direct examination, and the hidden history of how the U.S. legal system was actually modeled after early 20th century corporate arbitration. We will also uncover the secret to the silent negotiation, a technique used by early radio producers to get past censors, which you can use to navigate mediation without giving away your hand. The transmission is far from over, and the most complex signals are yet to be decoded. The transition from the fluid improvisational days of early radio to the highly regulated era of the 1934 Communications Act mirrors the evolution of the American legal system's approach to the family unit. To navigate the legal complexities of 2026, you must first understand that the courtroom is not a place for truth in the poetic sense. It is a soundstage where only the most technically proficient broadcast survives. In the early 20th century, radio stations operated on any frequency they chose, often drowning each other out in a chaotic mess of static. This is exactly how many men approach their divorce, by trying to shout louder than the opposition, hoping the volume of their grievances will translate into a favorable ruling. However, the federal government realized that the airwaves were a scarce resource that required strict management for the public interest. Similarly, the court views your time, your assets, and your access to your children as scarce resources that must be managed according to a predefined script. Let's look at the historical data of the Radio Act of 1927 and the Communications Act of 1934. These laws establish that no one owns the airwaves. They merely lease them under specific conditions of public service and good behavior. In the U.S. legal system, your marriage is often viewed through a similar lens of corporate arbitration. Historical trends indicate that since the no-fault divorce revolution of the late 1960s, the court has moved away from moral judgment toward a model of partnership liquidation. If you walk into a courtroom in 2026 expecting the judge to care about the emotional betrayal you feel, you are using an outdated transmitter. You are broadcasting on a frequency the court is no longer equipped to receive. To the judge, you are a co-manager of a domestic corporation that is now being dissolved. Your goal is to provide the most stable, data-driven broadcast possible to prove you are the reliable party to manage the remaining assets and the welfare of any children involved. Consider the script of the direct examination. In the golden age of radio, actors like Jack Webb and Dragnet mastered the art of the clinical, detached delivery. Just the facts, ma'am. This wasn't just a stylistic choice. It was a method to ensure the listener focused on the narrative rather than the actor's ego. When you are being deposed or testifying in 2026, you must adopt the Jack Webb frequency. Imagine a man named Mark, an engineer in Austin, Texas, who finds himself in a high-conflict custody battle in May 2026. Mark is being questioned by opposing counsel, who is using a technique known as rapid-fire pacing, a tactic used by early radio hosts to induce a slip of the tongue. The goal is to get Mark to react emotionally, to become the villain in the theater of the mind. Mark's strategy, however, is built on the silent negotiation technique. In the 1930s, radio producers had to deal with the Hays Code and the NAB Code, which strictly censored what could be said on air. To get complex themes across, producers used negative space, the things they didn't say. They would use a long pause or a subtle sound effect to imply a conclusion without stating it. In mediation or on the stand, Mark utilizes the 3-second buffer. Every time a question is asked, he waits exactly 3 seconds before speaking. This does 3 things. It kills the opposing counsel's momentum, it gives his own attorney time to object, and it ensures that his voice is recorded with a calm, deliberate cadence. Historical trends in courtroom psychology suggest that witnesses who use deliberate pauses are perceived by judges as more credible and less coached than those who answer instantly. Step by step, you must prepare your testimony script. Step 1. Identify the trigger frequencies. These are the topics where you know you are prone to emotional broadcasting. Perhaps your ex-spouse, new partner, or a specific financial loss. Step 2. Practice signal compression. When asked a question, give the shortest truthful answer possible. In radio, every second of dead air is expensive, but in a courtroom, every second of extra talking is a liability. If a question can be answered with a yes or a no, your broadcast should end there. Step 3. The redirection fade. If you are forced to discuss a negative topic, briefly acknowledge the fact, and then fade the narrative back to your current stability and future focus plans. Now, let's examine the hidden history of corporate arbitration in family law. Many men are surprised to find that the rules of evidence in a divorce feel cold and mechanical. This is because the American family court system heavily borrowed its structure from early 20th century industrial labor disputes. When a factory closed in 1925, the court didn't ask who was sad. It asked how the machinery was being divided and what the severance pay looked like. By viewing your divorce as a labor dispute rather than a personal tragedy, you gain a tactical advantage. You begin to look at alimony and child support not as a punishment, but as a legacy pension or a maintenance contract. This shift in perspective is vital. Case studies in 2026 show that men who approach mediation as a business merger, focusing on spreadsheets, cost of living adjustments, and tax implications, potential outcomes result in significantly lower long-term financial obligations compared to those who fight on the grounds of fairness or morality. We must also discuss the rating system of the court. In radio, the Hooper ratings determined which shows stayed on the air and which were canceled. In the legal system, your social ratings are determined by the guardian ad litem or the court-appointed social worker. These individuals are the critics of your show. Imagine if your life was being reviewed by a 1940s radio critic who only cared about the technical quality of the broadcast. They are looking for specific indicators of stability. Is the home environment quiet? Is the routine consistent? Is the communication with the co-parent professional and brief? Case studies of successful 50-50 custody awards in the United States indicate that the most influential factor is not the father's income, but the lack of noise in his life. The more boring and predictable your broadcast is, the higher your rating will be with the court. One of the most powerful tools used by early radio producers to bypass censors was the double entendre. While you should never be dishonest, you can use the technical truth to protect your interests. For instance, if asked about your social life, instead of becoming defensive, you speak in terms of community engagement and professional networking. You are not just hanging out. You are maintaining the social fabric necessary for your career, and by extension, your ability to provide. This is the art of reframing the signal. You are taking the raw data of your life and processing it through a filter that the court's receiver is tuned to hear. As we conclude this part of the masterclass, you must realize that the most expensive part of any radio broadcast is the equipment. In your legal case, the equipment is your legal team, your forensic accountants, and your psychological experts. If you buy cheap equipment, you will have a weak signal that is easily jammed by the opposition. However, even the most expensive equipment is useless if you don't know how to operate the controls. We have analyzed the script, the historical framework, and the psychological foley of the courtroom. But what happens when the opposition tries to cut your power line entirely? What happens when they move from the courtroom to your bank account with a level of precision you didn't see coming? The next phase of our deep dive focuses on the financial static, the specific, high-stakes maneuvers used to undervalue your contributions and overvalue your future earnings. We will look at the history of the Blue Book of the FCC and how its standards for public service are being used today to justify lifelong alimony. We will also uncover the discovery trap, a legal maneuver modeled after early 20th century corporate espionage, and how you can use a firewall strategy to protect your premarital assets from being pulled into the marital broadcast. The most dangerous signals are often the ones you can't hear. And in the next part, we start the frequency sweep of your financial life. To begin this frequency sweep, we must look at the most significant regulatory document in the history of American broadcasting and how its ghost haunts the modern family court. In 1946, the Federal Communications Commission released a report titled Public Service Responsibility of Broadcast Licensees. It was bound in a simple blue cover, earning it the nickname the Blue Book. This document was a shot across the bow for every radio station owner in the United States. It argued that because the airwaves were a limited public resource, the government had the right to demand a certain level of public service from those who held the licenses. Stations couldn't just broadcast what made them the most money. They had to provide sustaining programs, high-quality educational or cultural content that didn't have a commercial sponsor, to justify their continued use of the frequency. If you are a man in 2026 facing a divorce, you are currently holding a broadcast license that the state is about to audit. The court views your professional success, your accumulated assets, and your future earning capacity as a limited resource that has been utilized within the domestic frequency of your marriage. The Blue Book of Family Law dictates that you have a public service obligation to the family unit. When a marriage dissolves, the court often demands that you continue to broadcast a sustaining program in the form of alimony or spousal maintenance. They aren't interested in the fact that your commercial sponsor, the emotional partnership, has left the building. They are interested in the public interest, which in their view, is ensuring that the other party does not become a ward of the state and maintains a lifestyle commensurate with the one established during the broadcast. Imagine a scenario involving a man named David, a senior systems analyst in Charlotte, North Carolina, in June 2026. David has spent 20 years building his career, often working 60-hour weeks to secure a high-frequency income. His wife, Sarah, transitioned out of the workforce early in the marriage to manage the home. In the eyes of the 1946 FCC, David was the commercial station, and the marriage was the public service. Now that the divorce is active, David's attorney explains the potential outcomes regarding alimony. Because of the long duration of the marriage and the disparity in earning power, David is facing a sustaining program mandate that could last for half the length of the marriage or longer. This is the financial static that many men fail to hear until the bill for the transmitter arrives. Historical trends in the United States indicate that while many states have moved toward rehabilitative alimony, designed to get the lower-earning spouse back on their feet, the actual application remains highly discretionary. To navigate this, you must understand the concept of the discovery trap. In the early days of radio, during the fierce competition between giants like RCA and Philco, corporate espionage was common. Engineers would meticulously study the schematics of a rival's vacuum tubes to find a weakness. In 2026, your financial life is the schematic. The request for production is the legal tool used to perform this espionage. The opposing counsel will ask for every bank statement, every credit card bill, every Venmo history, and every crypto wallet address. They are looking for any signal that indicates you have been wasting marital assets or hiding them in the noise. Step by step, you must implement a financial firewall strategy. The first and most critical step is the identification of separate property. In many U.S. jurisdictions, assets you brought into the marriage are yours to keep, but only if you haven't allowed them to be transmuted into marital property. Imagine if a radio station in 1930 had a private library of recordings they owned before they got their national license. If they mixed those recordings into the general archive and lost the original logs, those recordings became part of the public broadcast. This is exactly what happens with your premarital savings or inheritance. If you deposited your premarital $10,000 into a joint checking account to pay for a kitchen remodel, you have likely transmuted that separate signal into marital static. In 2026, forensic accountants are the master engineers who perform asset tracing. They go back through the magnetic tape of your financial history to prove that the initial deposit was yours alone. However, this process is expensive and complex. Case studies show that men who maintain meticulous records of their premarital assets from day one have potential outcomes that are significantly more favorable during the property division phase. Second, you must understand the difference between active and passive appreciation. Let's say you owned a house before you got married. If the house increased in value simply because the market went up, that is passive appreciation, and it usually remains your separate property. But if you used marital funds, your salary earned during the marriage, to pay the mortgage or renovate the basement, you have introduced active appreciation. You have essentially used the marital transmitter to boost the signal of your private tower. The court will then calculate a marital interest in that appreciation. In 2026, with the volatility of the U.S. real estate market, this calculation can mean the difference of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Third, beware of the lifestyle creep trap. During the golden age of radio, as shows became more popular, the production costs skyrocketed. Bigger orchestras, more expensive actors, and elaborate sound effects became the norm. Once the audience, the family, is used to a certain level of production value, the court is hesitant to let you downgrade the broadcast. If your lifestyle in 2026 involves luxury leases, high-end vacations, and private schools, the court will use those historical trends to set the bar for support payments. Men often try to cut expenses the moment a divorce is filed, but this can backfire. If you suddenly stop the high-end broadcast, the court may view it as an attempt to artificially lower your income or lifestyle to evade your public service obligation. A high-stakes historical case study to consider is the 1940s battle over the FM frequency. Edwin Armstrong, the inventor of FM, fought a brutal legal and financial war with RCA, who wanted to protect their investment in the inferior AM technology. RCA used their massive legal resources to tie Armstrong up in litigation for years, eventually leading to his financial ruin. In a divorce, if you have significantly more assets, the opposing side may use a similar strategy of attrition. They will file motion after motion, demanding more discovery, more depositions, and more forensic audits, knowing that you are the one paying the engineers on both sides. This is why the firewall strategy must include a budget for litigation. You must know exactly how much signal you can afford to broadcast before you run out of power. To protect yourself, you need to conduct a shadow audit. Hire your own forensic accountant before the discovery phase hits its peak. Have them look at your finances through the lens of a hostile engineer. Have they found any commingled funds? Is there an unexplained gap in your records from 2024? By the time the formal request for production arrives, your schematic should be clean, categorized, and ready for transmission. This isn't about deception, it's about clarity. The less static there is in your financial disclosure, the less room there is for the opposing Foley artist to create a narrative of hidden wealth. But even with a perfect financial firewall, there is one signal that is almost impossible to mask: the value of your professional degree or license. In the 1980s, a landmark case in New York, O'Brien v. O'Brien, established that a medical license obtained during a marriage was a marital asset subject to valuation and distribution. While not every state follows this aggressive trend, the underlying philosophy remains. The court views your human capital, your ability to earn, as a product of the marital partnership. In 2026, this is being applied to everything from influencer accounts to specialized tech certifications. The airwaves are becoming increasingly crowded, and the regulatory environment is tightening. We have explored how the Blue Book of the past defines the alimony of the present, and how the discovery process serves as a form of modern corporate espionage. But what happens when the legal battle moves beyond the bank accounts and into the very core of your identity? What happens when the opposition tries to use your own history, your own words, and even your own hobbies to convince the judge that you are an unfit broadcaster? In the next part, we dive into the psychology of the script, how to manage the narrative of your character, and the specific techniques used by 1950s public relations experts that can be applied to protect your reputation in a modern U.S. courtroom. The frequency is shifting, and the most personal part of the broadcast is about to begin. By the mid-1950s, the golden era of American radio began to face an existential threat that would forever change how human beings perceive reality and character. The rise of television didn't just add a visual component to entertainment, it fundamentally altered the psychological metrics of trust. In the radio years, a man's reputation was built on the resonance of his voice and the consistency of his message. You could be a 50-year-old actor playing a 20-year-old war hero as long as your frequency was steady. But as the world transitioned into the visual age, the concept of the persona became the dominant legal and social currency. This shift was largely architected by pioneers of public relations like Edward Bernays, who famously utilized the engineering of consent to reshape public opinion. Bernays understood that the human brain does not weigh facts in a vacuum. It processes symbols and narratives. For a man navigating the legal landscape of 2026, this historical shift is the most critical lesson you can learn. In a U.S. courtroom, you are no longer just an individual. You are a brand. The judge is the consumer, and the opposing counsel is a rival marketing firm dedicated to your debranding. Imagine a scenario involving a man named Robert, a mid-level executive in a suburb of Chicago. It is July 2026, and Robert is in the early stages of a high-conflict divorce. Robert has always considered himself a good man, a provider, a hard worker, and a quiet neighbor. However, in the theater of the mind that is the family court system, being a good man is a broadcast that needs a clear signal and zero static. Robert's first mistake was assuming that his private character would speak for itself. He didn't realize that in 2026, the court utilizes what historical trends call character heuristics. Because judges are overwhelmed with cases, they look for mental shortcuts to determine who is the stable party and who is the volatile one. To manage your narrative, you must first understand the concept of the character audit, a technique perfected by 1950s PR experts to prepare celebrities for the scrutiny of the press. Step 1 of this audit is the digital signal sweep. In 2026, your social media accounts from as far back as 2020 are being archived by specialized software used by legal firms. These tools look for patterns. Robert's social media was filled with photos of his hobby, restoring vintage motorcycles and attending weekend rallies. To Robert, this was a healthy outlet for stress. To the opposing side's Foley artist, this was a narrative of a man who spent his weekends away from his children, engaging in high-risk behavior and associating with an unconventional demographic. Case studies in 2026 show that the aesthetic of your life often carries more weight than the reality of your actions. Potential outcomes for men who do not curate their digital signal toward an aesthetic of stability often include restricted temporary parenting time based solely on perceived lifestyle volatility. Step 2 involves the psychological script of reactive abuse. In the world of 1940s radio drama, the villain was often unmasked not through their actions, but through their reaction to the hero's calm. In a modern legal battle, the opposition will often broadcast intentional static, insults, false accusations, or financial provocations, specifically to trigger a reaction. The moment you respond with an angry text or a raised voice during a phone call, you have provided the Foley artist with the exact sound effect they need to label you as the aggressor. Historical trends in family law indicate that a single recorded outburst can outweigh years of consistent, calm behavior. One final lesson from the 1950s PR playbook is the reframing of the climax. Every story has a moment of peak tension. In a divorce, this is often the mediation or the final trial. Most men go into this climax feeling like a defendant. PR experts would tell you to go in like a consultant. You are there to provide a solution to a problem the state has, the dissolution of a domestic unit. You are the expert broadcaster presenting a plan for how the future should look. When you shift from a defensive posture to a solution-oriented one, you reclaim the narrative power. You are no longer the character being judged. You are the producer presenting a vision. As we move through this masterclass, we are beginning to see how the technical history of the American media landscape provides a roadmap for modern survival. We have covered the financial firewalls and the psychological persona, but there is a looming threat we haven't touched: the dead air. In radio, silence is the ultimate failure. In a divorce, silence in the parenting schedule or a lack of communication can be used to permanently fade you out of your children's lives. What happens when the opposition tries to jam your signal during your scheduled time? What are the specific legal filters you can use to ensure your frequency remains clear during the most important broadcast of your life? Your relationship with your children. In the next part, we decode the parenting plan as a broadcast schedule and how to prevent the opposition from cutting your transmission during the hours that matter most. The script is getting more complex, and the stakes are about to reach their highest frequency yet. In the history of the Federal Communications Commission, few things were as strictly regulated as the station log. In the 1930s and 40s, every radio station in the United States was legally required to maintain an accurate, minute-by-minute account of every signal they sent into the atmosphere. If a technician missed a single entry, or if the station went to dead air for more than a few seconds without explanation, they risked heavy fines or the permanent revocation of their license. This level of scrutiny was not just about bureaucracy, it was about accountability to the public. For a man in 2026, your parenting plan is your station log. If your plan is vague, inconsistent, or filled with dead air, you are essentially inviting the court, your regulatory body, to pull your license as a primary broadcaster in your children's lives. To understand how to build a bulletproof parenting schedule, We must look at the National Broadcasting Company and their development of the red and blue networks. NBC realized early on that a single frequency could not satisfy every audience. They needed separate, distinct streams of content that operated in parallel. In modern family law, when high-conflict dynamics make co-parenting the shared signal impossible, the system pivots toward parallel parenting. This is a historical trend in U.S. courts where, rather than forcing two parents to communicate constantly, the court establishes two completely separate broadcasts. You manage your house, your rules, and your schedule, and the other parent does the same. There is no crossover, no interference, and most importantly, no opportunity for signal jamming. Imagine a scenario involving a man named Michael, a software developer in Denver, Colorado, in August 2026. Michael is navigating a separation where every exchange of the children becomes a theatrical production of conflict. His ex-spouse uses the ambiguity of their current temporary agreement to cut his transmission. She might claim the children are sick, or that a school event changed, or simply stop responding to texts as the exchange time approaches. Michael is experiencing interference with visitation, a digital age version of the signal jamming used during the Cold War. To counter this, Michael must move from a general narrative to a technical specification. Step by step, you must draft your parenting plan with the precision of a 1940s radio engineer. Step 1 is the definition of the handover frequency. In 2026, do not use phrases like reasonable visitation or alternating weekends. These are low-resolution signals that create static. Instead, specify the exact GPS coordinates of the exchange, the exact second the transition occurs, and the specific protocol if one party is late. In the radio era, if a show was supposed to start at 7 p.m., the engineer had the fader up at 6 hours 59 minutes and 59 seconds. Your parenting plan should state, exchange to occur at the north entrance of the public library at 18 hours on Friday. Step 2 is the first right of refusal clause. This is the emergency broadcast system of parenting plans. Historical trends in the U.S. show that many conflicts arise when one parent cannot watch the children and calls a third-party babysitter instead of the other parent. A well-drafted 2026 parenting plan includes a specific time trigger. For example, if a parent is unavailable for more than 4 hours, they must offer that time to the other parent first. This ensures that the children are with the primary broadcaster as often as possible. Case studies indicate that fathers who consistently utilize their right of first refusal are viewed by the court as more dedicated and proactive, which can lead to potential outcomes involving increased parenting time during future modifications. Step 3 is the communication firewall. In the 1950s, radio stations used limiters to prevent a signal from peaking and distorting the broadcast. In your life, you need a digital limiter. In 2026, U.S. courts are increasingly mandating the use of parenting apps like Our Family Wizard or Talking Parents. These platforms act as the master control room. Every message is archived, time-stamped, and cannot be deleted. This eliminates the he said, she said static. If Michael's ex-spouse claims she told him about a doctor's appointment, but it isn't in the app's calendar, the court views it as a non-transmission. Using these tools isn't just about convenience. It's about creating a verified logbook that a judge can review in 60 seconds to see who is following the script and who is creating the noise. Let's look at the historical data regarding parental alienation as a form of frequency masking. In the golden age of radio, if a stronger station wanted to drown out a weaker one, they would broadcast on a slightly overlapping frequency. This is what happens when one parent subtly, or overtly, undermines the other's character to the children. They are trying to mask your signal, so the children can no longer hear your broadcast. Case studies in 2026 show that courts are becoming more sophisticated in identifying this behavior. However, the burden of proof is high. You cannot just claim alienation. You must show a pattern of systematic signal degradation. This means documenting every missed phone call, every forgotten sports jersey, and every instance where your parenting time was cut short. Imagine if a radio station in 1945 simply stopped playing music and started broadcasting white noise whenever their rival was on the air. The FCC would have shut them down. In a U.S. courtroom, if you can prove a pattern of intentional interference, the potential outcomes can include a transfer of primary residence. The court's logic is simple. The parent most likely to foster a relationship with the other parent is the one who should have primary custody. By being the parent who never jams the signal, who always facilitates the other's broadcast, you position yourself as the broadcaster in the public interest. We must also discuss the holiday rotation script. In the 1930s, the biggest broadcasts of the year were the Christmas specials. These were planned months in advance with military precision. Your holiday schedule in 2026 should be no different. A common error men make is agreeing to split holidays or decide later. This is a recipe for a holiday blackout. Historical trends suggest that an odd/even year rotation is the most stable signal. In odd years you have Thanksgiving. In even years you have Christmas. This removes the need for negotiation, which is where the most static occurs. Furthermore, consider the acoustics of the transition. In radio, a crossfade is a smooth transition from one sound to another. In parenting, the transition between houses is often a hard cut that leaves the children in a state of shock. To protect your broadcast, you must master the low-impact exchange. This means the exchange happens at a neutral location, a school, a park, or a curbside, where the two parents do not have to interact. This prevents the children from witnessing the static of parental conflict. Case studies of long-term child adjustment show that the conflict at the exchange is more damaging to the child's receiver than the divorce itself. As we conclude this part of the masterclass, you should see your parenting plan not as a set of restrictions, but as a protected frequency. It is the legal framework that ensures your voice continues to reach your children without interference. But even with a perfect schedule and a clear signal, there is one factor that can still pull you off the air: the cost of the transmitter. In the next part, we dive into the high-stakes world of child support and financial maintenance. We will uncover the hidden history of how the U.S. government incentivizes certain support structures and the specific step-by-step methods you can use to ensure your subscription fees are calculated fairly, accurately, and without the hidden charges that often bankrupt men before the broadcast even hits its stride. The financial audit is coming, and you need to be ready to defend your bottom line. In the early 1940s, the American radio industry faced a crisis that nearly silenced the nation's airwaves. It was known as the ASCAP boycott. For years, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers had controlled the licensing fees for almost every piece of music broadcast in the United States. They operated on a subscription model, charging radio stations a percentage of their gross revenue, just for the right to keep the music playing. By 1940, ASCAP demanded a massive increase in these royalties, essentially a tax on the station's success. In response, broadcasters did something radical. They formed their own organization, Broadcast Music Incorporated, or BMI, and refused to play any ASCAP-licensed music for months. They realized that if the cost of the broadcast exceeded the value of the signal, the station would go dark. This historical battle over royalties is the exact template for understanding child support and financial maintenance in 2026. You are the broadcaster, and the state, acting through the court, is demanding a royalty for the children's standard of living. If you do not understand the formula used to calculate these fees, you may find yourself paying a royalty that is mathematically disconnected from your actual signal strength. To navigate the financial audit of 2026, we must first unmask the hidden history of the U.S. government's involvement in child support. Most men believe child support is a private matter between parents, but since the 1975 amendments to the Social Security Act, specifically Title 4D, it has been a federalized system of state incentives. Under Title 4D, the federal government provides matching funds to states based on the amount of child support they collect. This creates a historical trend where the state has a bureaucratic incentive to keep support orders high, as a higher order often translates to more federal reimbursement for the state's enforcement agencies. When you enter a courtroom, you are not just negotiating with an ex-spouse. You are interacting with a system that has a technical preference for high-frequency collections. Let's look at the step-by-step calculation of your subscription fee. In 2026, the majority of U.S. states utilize the income shares model. This model is built on the economic assumption that a child should receive the same proportion of parental income that they would have received if the parents lived together. Imagine a man named Christopher, a high-performing sales director in Phoenix, Arizona. In May 2026, Christopher is facing a child support hearing. The court looks at his gross monthly income, the total raw signal before any filters like taxes or health insurance are applied. Christopher's first error is failing to define his signal correctly. Because he earns a base salary plus volatility-based commissions, the opposing Foley artist tries to average his best 3 months to create an artificially high-income baseline. Christopher must perform an income audit. Step 1. Distinguish between guaranteed signal and occasional peaks. Historical trends in 2026 case studies suggest that men who provide 3 to 5 years of tax returns can demonstrate that a one-time bonus or a peak commission year is not a sustainable broadcast level. Step 2. Apply the mandatory deductions. In many jurisdictions, you can subtract your own health insurance premiums, mandatory retirement contributions, and taxes to reach your net income. This is your net broadcast power. Step 3. The parenting time offset. In 2026, most states apply a mathematical formula that reduces the support obligation based on the number of overnights the children spend at your house. If you have 50-50 custody, your support obligation is often significantly lower than if you are a weekend-only broadcaster. This is why the parenting plan we discussed in the previous part is not just a social document, it is a financial schematic. We also have to address the ghost signal, technically known as imputed income. In the radio era, the FCC could penalize a station if they believed the station was intentionally lowering its power to avoid certain regulations. In a 2026 divorce, if you decide to quit a high-paying job to become a freelance artist the moment the papers are served, the court will likely impute income to you. They will broadcast a signal on your behalf, pretending you are still earning your old salary and calculating support based on that phantom number. Case studies show that potential outcomes for men who are genuinely laid off or facing a career downturn involve a vocational evaluation. You must hire an expert to prove that the current market in 2026 does not support your previous income level, effectively recalibrating the court's receiver to the reality of your current situation. Now, let's look at the hidden charges, which are the extraordinary expenses that act like premium upgrades on a cable bill. These include private school tuition, high-level extracurriculars, and unreimbursed medical expenses. In the 1940s, a radio station might agree to a base fee, but then get hit with line item charges for every remote broadcast or special event. In your 2026 decree, you must ensure these are defined as pro rata expenses. This means if you earn 60% of the total combined income and the other parent earns 40%, you only pay 60% of the soccer fees, not 100%. Furthermore, you must demand the right of verification. You should never pay for an extraordinary expense until you see the original invoice from the provider. Historical trends show that without this filter, support payments are often treated as general revenue rather than specific reimbursements. Imagine if a radio sponsor in 1935 agreed to pay for a 30-minute show, but was then billed for an hour because the station decided to run an unapproved extended ending. You would call that a breach of contract. In a divorce, if you are paying for daycare that is no longer being used because the children are now in public school, you are paying for dead air. Step by step, you must include a modification trigger in your final order. This is a clause that automatically adjusts the support when a major expense, like daycare or a specific medical treatment, ends. Without this, you have to spend thousands of dollars on a lawyer just to stop paying for a service that doesn't exist anymore. The most dangerous financial maneuver in 2026 is the temporary order trap. In the early days of television, many stars signed temporary contracts for a pilot episode, only to find that those same terms were legally binding for the next 5 years. Many men agreed to a high temporary support amount just to be nice or to keep the peace during the initial separation. However, judges are creatures of habit. If you have been paying $3,000 a month for 6 months without going bankrupt, the judge will assume that is the correct frequency for the final order. You must fight for an accurate number from day one. Do not allow a temporary signal to become your permanent broadcast. As we reach the conclusion of this financial deep dive, we have decoded the Title 4D incentive structure, the income shares model, and the technical defense against imputed income. But there is a final darker frequency we must address. In the history of radio, the most feared event was the hostile takeover, when a rival company would buy up enough stock to seize control of the station's assets and fire the management. In a divorce, this is the battle over the marital home and the retirement accounts. What happens when the house you spent 10 years paying for is treated as a trophy for the other side? How do you protect the 401k that represents your entire future broadcast capacity? In the next part, we move into the asset liquidation phase, uncovering the historical strategies used by corporate raiders in the 1980s that can be applied to protect your equity in 2026. The technical audit of your wealth is about to get aggressive, and you need to know how to hold the line on your most valuable towers. In the late 1980s, the American landscape was dominated by a different kind of broadcast, the sound of the ticker tape and the aggressive high-stakes language of the leveraged buyout. This was the era of the corporate raider, men like Carl Icahn and firms like Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, who looked at stable, long-standing American companies not as institutions, but as collections of undervalued assets waiting to be stripped and sold. This period culminated in the 1988 takeover of RJR Nabisco, a $25 billion battle that was later chronicled as Barbarians at the Gate. The strategy of the corporate raider was simple. Identify a target with a strong balance sheet, use massive amounts of debt to acquire it, and then liquidate the internal components to pay off that debt, leaving the original management with nothing. If you are a man entering the asset division phase of a divorce in 2026, you must realize that your domestic corporation is currently facing a hostile takeover. The opposing legal team is not looking at your marriage as a shared history. They are looking at it through the lens of a corporate raider, seeking to identify every undervalued tower in your portfolio, your home, your retirement, and your liquid equity, and extract the maximum value before the final broadcast ends. Imagine a scenario involving a man named Greg, a manufacturing director in Cincinnati, Ohio. It is October 2026, and Greg has spent 15 years building a portfolio that includes a suburban home with significant equity and a 401k that has grown steadily through the market volatility of the early 2020s. In Greg's mind, these are his security towers. However, in the 2026 legal landscape, these assets are the primary targets of the liquidation phase. To defend these towers, Greg must understand the historical trends of corporate defense, specifically the poison pill strategy. In corporate law, a poison pill is a maneuver that makes a company's stock less attractive to a raider, often by allowing existing shareholders to buy more shares at a discount if a takeover is attempted. In your divorce, your poison pill is the technical identification of liabilities and tax implications associated with every asset. Step by step, we must begin with the valuation of the headquarters, the marital home. In the radio era, a station's value was tied to the height and location of its transmitter. In 2026, the value of your home is a fluctuating signal. Historical trends in the U.S. real estate market show that many men make the mistake of accepting a zestimate or a basic market analysis as the truth. A corporate raider would never do this. They would demand a full forensic appraisal. You must do the same. But here is the 2026 twist. You must factor in the cost of disposition. If the court orders a sale, there are commissions, closing costs, and potentially capital gains taxes. If Greg's home is valued at $600,000, but it would cost $60,000 to sell it, the actual marital equity is not $600,000, it is $540,000. By accounting for these hidden costs up front, you are effectively lowering the attractiveness of the asset for liquidation. Furthermore, we must address the mortgage interest rate trap of 2026. Many men want to keep the house to provide stability for their children, their sustaining program. However, if your current mortgage is locked in at a historical low of 3%, and you are forced to buy out your spouse's equity, the court may require you to refinance the entire property at the 2026 market rate, which could be double or triple your current frequency. This is a form of high-interest debt that a corporate raider uses to cripple a target. Case studies indicate that potential outcomes for men who refinance under these conditions include a catastrophic loss of monthly cash flow. Instead, look at the historical strategy of the shared equity agreement, or a deferred sale, which allows you to maintain the low-interest broadcast while delaying the final liquidation until a more favorable market cycle. Next, we move to the retirement tower, the 401k and the pension. This is governed by the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, or ERISA. This is the federal regulatory body that dictates how your future wealth is divided through a document called a Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or QDRO. A common historical error is treating $1 in a 401k as equal to $1 in a savings account. A corporate raider knows that the 401k is pre-tax signal. If Greg has $500,000 in his 401k, and he gives his spouse $250,000, she is receiving deferred tax liability, while he is losing compounded growth power. To defend the retirement tower, you must perform a premarital trace, modeled after the initial capital investment audits used in the 1980s. If Greg had $50,000 in his 401k before he got married in 2011, he must prove that this seed capital, and all the growth associated with it, is his separate property. Historical trends show that many administrators of retirement plans only keep records for 7 to 10 years. If you don't have your own archived recordings of your statements from 2011, the court may assume the entire tower is marital property. Potential outcomes for men who maintain their own records include carving out significant portions of their retirement from the division, effectively protecting their future golden parachute. Let's look at a case study from the 1985 takeover of TWA by Carl Icahn. Icahn didn't just want the planes, he wanted the routes and the pension fund. He used the company's own assets as collateral to buy the company. In your divorce, if you are using your separate property assets to pay for marital debts or to fund the litigation, you are effectively leveraging your own tower to fund your own takeover. You must implement a strict capital separation protocol. Any funds used to defend your corporation should ideally come from marital cash flow, not from your premarital reserve signal. There is also the concept of the executive bonus, your future earning capacity. In some U.S. jurisdictions, the opposition may attempt to value your goodwill if you own a business or a professional practice. They will argue that your reputation is a marital asset that can be liquidated. This is the ultimate hostile takeover, because it attempts to take a piece of a broadcast you haven't even aired yet. To counter this, you must demonstrate that your success is tied to your personal signal, your individual talent and effort that exists independently of the marriage. Case studies in 2026 show that men who utilize vocational experts to distinguish between enterprise goodwill, the business, and personal goodwill, the man, are often able to protect their future earnings from being raided during the property split. Imagine if a radio station in 1948 was forced to give half of its record library to a rival, but the rival got to choose all the hits while the original station was left with the B-sides and the static. This is what happens when you don't control the asset allocation. You should aim to keep the assets that have the highest growth signal and trade away the assets that have high maintenance or high liability. If you have to choose between keeping $50,000 in a house that requires a new roof and $50,000 in a liquid brokerage account, the raider's choice is the liquid account. Your choice should be the one that fits your long-term broadcasting strategy. As we move toward the final stages of this masterclass, we have dismantled the corporate raiding tactics used against your equity. We have identified the poison pills and the technical trace of your retirement towers. But there is one final piece of the script that we haven't decoded: the final broadcast or the trial. Most divorces settle, but the ones that don't are decided by a producer who doesn't know you, hasn't heard your full history, and is looking for a clean ending to the show. How do you present your season finale in a way that ensures your character is vindicated? What are the specific techniques of evidence synchronicity that can make your master tape the only one the court wants to listen to? In the next part, we dive into the art of the trial and the final edit, uncovering how the most successful American radio dramas of the 1950s used pacing and contrast to win over an audience, and how you can use those same techniques to secure your future. The airwaves are clear, but the most important transmission of your life is just seconds away from going live. In the mid-1950s, the landscape of American radio drama reached its creative zenith with shows like Gunsmoke and Yours Truly, Johnny Dollar. These programs succeeded not just because of the writing, but because of a technical mastery of pacing and contrast. Producers realized that the audience's attention was a fragile signal that could be lost if the broadcast became too monotonous or too chaotic. They used the pregnant pause to emphasize a dramatic reveal, and the quick cut to simulate the frantic energy of a chase. This was the era of the final edit, where the raw recordings were meticulously spliced on magnetic tape to ensure the most compelling narrative survived. As you enter the courtroom for your final trial in 2026, you must realize that you are no longer in the rehearsal phase. You are live on the air, and the judge is your most critical listener. Every word you speak and every piece of evidence you present must be part of a synchronized broadcast designed to survive the ultimate scrutiny of the legal system. Imagine a scenario involving a man named Thomas, a senior architect in Atlanta, Georgia. It is September 2026, and Thomas has reached the final hearing of his 2-year legal battle. The tension in the courtroom is palpable, reminiscent of the high-stakes atmosphere of a live 1950s radio play where any mistake is permanent. Thomas has spent months preparing his production Bible, the exhaustive binder of exhibits, financial records, and parenting logs. His goal is to ensure evidence synchronicity. In radio history, if the sound of a gunshot didn't perfectly align with the actor's line, the illusion of reality was shattered. In a 2026 courtroom, if your testimony about being a present father does not perfectly align with the digital metadata of your location history or your school portal login records, your credibility, your signal strength will drop to zero. Historical trends in the United States indicate that most family law cases settle before trial, but for the approximately 5 to 10% that do go to a final hearing, the potential outcomes are heavily influenced by the aesthetics of testimony. Case studies show that judges, who often hear 3 to 5 cases a day, suffer from decision fatigue. They are looking for a clear, well-paced narrative that makes their job easier. If Thomas presents a chaotic, emotional broadcast filled with static and interruptions, the judge will subconsciously tune out. To master the art of the trial, you must follow a step-by-step performance script. Step 1 is the pre-production review. In the 1950s, radio actors would perform a cold read of the script to identify any linguistic traps. You must do the same with your own history. Review every text message, every email, and every bank statement the opposition has marked as an exhibit. Identify your weak frequencies, those moments where you were less than perfect. A historical strategy used by successful trial attorneys is drawing the sting. This means you admit your flaws during your own direct examination before the opposing counsel can use them to create a dramatic climax during cross-examination. By controlling the reveal, you maintain the narrative power. You are the one editing the tape, not the rater. Step 2 is the technical mastery of the stand. When Thomas takes the stand in 2026, he is effectively the lead voice actor. He must utilize the 3-second buffer we decoded earlier, but now he must add the element of vocal contrast. In the radio drama The Shadow, the narrator used a deep, resonant tone to convey authority and a softer tone to convey empathy. When Thomas discusses his children, his voice should reflect a grounded, empathetic frequency. When he discusses complex financial data or responding to false accusations, he should shift to the Jack Webb frequency, detached, clinical, and factual. Historical trends in courtroom psychology suggest that witnesses who can modulate their emotional output based on the subject matter are perceived as more intelligent and less manipulative. Step 3 is the management of the antagonist. In any great radio drama, the villain's goal is to force the hero out of character. During cross-examination, the opposing counsel will attempt to overmodulate your signal. They will ask leading questions, interrupt your answers, and use a pacing designed to induce anxiety. Imagine if a 1954 radio host tried to hijack a guest's interview by talking over them. The guest's only defense was to maintain their own tempo. In 2026, your defense is the anchor technique. No matter how fast or aggressive the questions are, you maintain a consistent, slow-speed broadcast. If the lawyer is shouting, you speak quieter. If they are rushing, you take your full 3-second pause. You are the master control operator of your own transmitter. We must also analyze the historical data of judicial perception. In the transition from radio to television, audiences began to look for the micro-expression, the subtle twitch of an eye or a clenching of the jaw. In a 2026 courtroom, while there may not be cameras, the judge is watching your physical foley. If you are rolling your eyes, sighing, or shaking your head while the other side is testifying, you are broadcasting static. Case studies indicate that men who maintain a neutral visual signal, sitting up straight, taking notes calmly, and looking at the judge when speaking, have potential outcomes that favor them in discretionary rulings. You must remain in character even when the microphone is off. Furthermore, let's look at the concept of evidence compression. In the late 1950s, engineers developed ways to pack more information into the same bandwidth. In your trial, you have a limited amount of airtime. You cannot tell every story or air every grievance. You must select the high-value signals. If you have 50 text messages showing the other parent was late, don't show all 50. Select the 3 most egregious examples and present them as a representative sample. This respects the judge's time and prevents your best evidence from being buried in the noise. Potential outcomes for men who use a streamlined evidence script include a more focused and favorable final decree, as the judge can easily recall the key points of the broadcast. Now, consider the final edit of the character arc. Every radio play ended with a resolution that left the audience with a specific feeling. Your closing argument, delivered through your attorney, is the final scene of your season. It shouldn't just be a list of demands, it should be a vision of the future. You are proposing a new program schedule for your life and your children's lives that is stable, sustainable, and in the public interest. Historical trends show that judges are more likely to sign off on a plan that feels like a narrative resolution rather than a continued conflict. Imagine if the legendary Orson Welles had ended War of the Worlds by simply saying it was a joke and then walking away. The impact would have been lost. Instead, he delivered a poetic closing that contextualized the entire experience. In 2026, your final statement, whether through your testimony or your attorney's closing, must contextualize the divorce not as a failure, but as a technical recalibration. You are moving the broadcast to a new, clearer frequency. As we conclude this penultimate part of the masterclass, we have mastered the pacing of the trial, the contrast of the testimony, and the technical synchronization of the evidence. We have seen how the 1950s masters of the airwaves built narratives that survived for decades. But what happens after the judge hits the stop record button? What happens when the trial is over, the decree is signed, and you are left to manage the syndication of your new life? How do you prevent the old static from creeping back into your new broadcast? In the final part of this series, we decode the series finale and the spin-off, how to build a long-term high-frequency life in the aftermath of divorce, and the secret history of how the most successful radio characters were reinvented for the next generation. The final transmission is coming, and it's time to decide what your new story will be. The final stroke of the judge's gavel in a 2026 courtroom is the ultimate sound effect. It is the closing chord of a chaotic, high-stakes series finale that has likely cost you more in emotional and financial capital than any broadcast ever should. But in the world of American media history, the end of a series is rarely the end of the story. When the golden age of radio began to fade into the glow of the television era, the industry didn't just vanish, it entered the era of syndication and the spin-off. Icons like Matt Dillon from Gunsmoke or the detective from Yours Truly, Johnny Dollar didn't simply stop existing because the radio show ended. They were reinvented, recast, and moved to a new frequency with higher resolution and a broader reach. For a man standing on the other side of a final decree in 2026, you are currently in the most critical phase of your own media history, the transition from the tragedy of the broadcast to the profitability of the syndication. You are no longer the character being acted upon by a legal script. You are now the executive producer of the spin-off. To understand how to manage your post-divorce life, we must look at the historical data of the Desilu model. In the mid-1950s, Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball realized that the real power in Hollywood wasn't in the live performance, but in the ownership of the master tapes. They pioneered the concept of the rerun, allowing them to broadcast the same content over and over for decades without the cost of new production. In your new life, your final decree is your master tape. If you have spent the last 9 parts of this masterclass building a clear, data-driven, and technical parenting plan and financial firewall, you now have a master tape that can run on autopilot. Historical trends in post-divorce litigation suggest that 80% of secondary legal battles, the zombie signals that haunt men for years, occur because the original decree was left in a low-resolution format. Imagine a scenario involving a man named James, a project manager in Seattle, Washington, in December 2026. James has just received his signed final order. His instinct is to throw the documents in a drawer and never look at them again. This is a tactical error in the post-production phase. In the radio era, a station engineer didn't just walk away once the show was live. They performed a final transmission audit. Step by step, James must now execute his own audit to ensure the signal remains clear. First, he must handle the transfer of titles. If the court ordered a house or a vehicle to be moved into his sole name, he must do so within 30 days. In 2026, with the high-frequency speed of digital credit reporting, a single missed deadline on a quitclaim deed or a vehicle title transfer can create a massive amount of static in your financial credit score. Second, James must implement the automatic payment filter. If he is paying child support or alimony, he should not rely on manual transfers or the memory of his own transmitter. Historical trends show that men who set up automatic income withholding or recurring bank transfers have potential outcomes involving significantly lower rates of contempt of court filings. In the 1930s, the FCC would fine a station for a single minute of unrecorded dead air. In 2026, the state will penalize you for a single day of unrecorded payment. By automating the broadcast, you remove the human error and the opportunity for the opposition to claim you are off the air. Now, let's look at the character reinvention of the spin-off. When Gunsmoke moved from radio to television, the producers faced a dilemma. The radio actor, William Conrad, had the perfect voice, but he didn't have the look they wanted for the visual medium of the 1950s. They brought in James Arness to be the new face of Matt Dillon. This is exactly what you must do in 2026. Your old character, the one defined by the conflict of the marriage, must be retired. You are now being cast in a new role. Case studies of men who thrive post-divorce show that a pivot towards self-optimization is the most effective way to drown out the old signal. This means taking the time and capital you previously spent on litigation and investing it into your own production value. Whether it is physical fitness, professional certifications, or rebuilding your social network, you are increasing the resolution of your new broadcast. There is also the concept of the persistent static, technically known as post-decree modifications. In the radio era, atmospheric conditions like sunspots could interfere with even the strongest signal. In 2026, life changes like a job loss, a relocation, or the changing needs of your children can interfere with your final order. You must understand the threshold of material change. Historical trends indicate that you cannot just change your broadcast schedule because you feel like it. You must prove a significant change in circumstances. Step by step, you should maintain your station log, your record of parenting time and expenses, even after the divorce is over. If the day comes when you need to recalibrate the signal, you will have the archive data to prove why the change is necessary. Consider the potential outcomes of a man who fails to manage his new frequency. Imagine if a radio station in 1955 kept playing the same old music from 1920 even as the audience moved to rock and roll. The station would go bankrupt. If you keep broadcasting the same anger and the same arguments with your ex-spouse in 2026, you are playing old music to an empty room, and the only person paying the bill is you. To achieve high retention success in your new life, you must adopt the parallel parenting protocol as a permanent feature of your broadcast. You manage your studio, they manage theirs. No interference. No overlapping frequencies. Finally, we must address the legacy broadcast. In the final years of the golden age of radio, some of the most powerful programs were the ones that reflected on the history of the medium itself. As you move forward, the relationship you have with your children is the most important signal you will ever transmit. Historical data in developmental psychology suggests that the long-term success of children after a divorce is directly correlated to the lack of conflict they witness between their parents. By being the most stable, most reliable, and most professional broadcaster in the room, you are ensuring that your children's receivers are not damaged by the static of your past. The year is 2026, and the world is noisier than it has ever been. But you now have the technical schematics to navigate the most complex legal and social frequencies in the United States. We have traveled from the Martian invasion of 1938 to the corporate raiders of the 1980s, all the way to the digital forensic audits of today. You have learned how to build a financial firewall, how to manage your character in the theater of the mind, and how to protect your most valuable towers. The script is written. The engineers have set the levels. The red light is glowing in the studio. Your life is not a tragedy that ended with a divorce. It is a long-running series that has just been picked up for a massive high-budget spin-off. You are the talent, you are the producer, and you are the owner of the airwaves. It is time to stop looking back at the static of the old broadcast and start focusing on the clarity of the new signal. The transmission is yours. The frequency is clear. It is time to go live. While this masterclass has concluded its deep dive into the technical and historical infrastructure of your transition, the world of modern men's advocacy and legal strategy is constantly evolving. There are always new signals to decode and new technologies to master as the legal landscape of the United States shifts toward more equitable and data-driven outcomes. The next era of your story begins today, and the broadcast is just getting started.